Vicki Delmon from the World Bank's legal department, who you heard from earlier, and Jane Jamieson from IFC's advisory department will talk about the rural and peri-urban water projects they've been working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. First of all, I wanted to give a little bit of background to those of you who may not be as familiar certainly with the first session's speakers and me on water sector and some of the challenges that you face, particularly in the PPP space, and just give a bit of a flavour as to what water sector comprises in the urban versus the rural sector. So urban water is all about large piped water systems. The challenges that face the sector consistently across the world, and it's my frustration, having worked in it for many years, that unfortunately we're still facing the same issues time and time again. There's very low cost recovery. There is a general sense that water is a public good, and it comes from up above, and therefore why should there be a significant cost attached to it? But unfortunately, it does cost a lot to actually get water to a tap cleaned. And so there's a lack of maintenance and investment, because the reality is the money is not coming from consumers, it is also not coming from the public budget. And that is generally the case across the world, both in developing and developed countries. You often have intermittent supply, so the idea that you will have water flowing from your taps 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is not a reality for much of the urban population of the world. And poorer communities are unserved. So whether it's the less accessible communities, or it's the communities that are not official, they often do not get served. And so what happens with them is that they do get served by a private sector that comes in and quite often charges very significantly for that water. And you have theft of water as another challenge facing the urban sector. So I said the private providers are filling the gaps at a cost, and particularly it's the poorest urban dwellers who pay the most significant amounts for water. Sanitation, unfortunately, is very limited centralized sewerage. Septage is the main way, that's septic tanks and localized sewerage facilities. Very little sewage treatment around the world. And I'm sorry that I'm just talking about this before lunch. It's probably going to make your stomach feel a little squirmy, but it's unfortunate, the reality that, in fact, even in developed countries, it's only in the past few decades that we've had really consistent sewage treatment. So we're not that far ahead in the developed world. In rural water, it's a very different picture. You have a lot of community-run systems. You may be just talking about a water pump. You may have some pipes. But the likelihood is that the majority of the households will not be receiving a tap connection, that they will be using a kiosk scheme, so there will be a group connection. Or it may be that people are trekking very great distances to a river source. And sanitation, well, it's very little at all. And particularly in talking about the distant river source, it's particularly relevant in the inclusion discussion, because throughout the world, generally, in rural communities, it's the women and the girls who are going to collect water and trekking miles each day to do so. And quite often that also means that girls don't get to go to school because they're busy doing that for their families. So it's a very significant issue when it comes to inclusion. There are massive opportunities in the water sector. There is huge investment required, as I said, both on the urban and rural side. Sanitation, treatment and systems, again, very significant area where there could be investment. And more and more sophisticated technologies which are relevant, particularly like desalination in countries where there are limitations on water resources. And I'll just talk very quickly about some of the things that the World Bank is doing in that respect, but there are opportunities. But the challenges that we face, as I said, water is seen as a public good, that it's free. There's a huge suspicion about involving the private sector in the water sector across the board. Waterborne disease is a very significant problem in a lot of countries. It's a huge killer, but water still doesn't end up being a political priority. And one of my theories about that is because you've got pipes underground, you can't go and cut a tape at a ceremony to found a large water pipe. They're hidden assets. They're not quite as interesting as being able to open a stadium or even a power plant. And there are significant vested interests in keeping the status quo. There's, as I said, lots of water theft, but also within the water sector itself, there are vested interests. And there has been some poor performance of water PPPs around the world, not as great as is suggested, but there has been. And then the recognition that water resources have to be shared with industry and with agriculture. And so it's not just the domestic water provision that needs to be fitted into all of this equation. The World Bank Group has lots of different things that are going on in water. You've got the Water and Sanitation Programme, GPOBA, which is involved in output-based aid, a couple of these things that Jane will talk about. And we talked about IFC advisory services and also the World Bank and IFC investments and guarantees. One of the things that I've been working on recently with the Water and Sanitation Programme is that they have been rolling out rural projects around the world, and they asked me, because they've been doing them on very specific case-by-case basis, they've asked me to look at the contracts, see what common threads can be drawn out. Most of the projects have involved little investment. It's been mainly grants put into rural schemes and then bringing in the private sector, bringing in entrepreneurs to actually run some of these systems. And so gradually building up a market in the rural sector. And Jane is going to talk about a couple of projects in East Africa, but I'd like to flag the fact that from my own analysis, there's a lot that can be learned from the West African experiences, from the experiences in Peru and in other civil law countries where there is greater tradition for affirmage type contracts, we were talking earlier, which can be well suited to that. And as we're thinking at trying to actually encourage more scale up on these sorts of projects, and indeed try and start encouraging greater investment on the private sector side, and even the possibility we're looking at in Kenya and a couple of other countries at how you bring in commercial banks into all of this, in helping the private sector to actually finance some of this infrastructure. We're looking at some of the experiences in the civil law jurisdictions where I think there has been some quite significant success. So I'm going to flip through and hand over to Jane to talk about Uganda and South Sudan.